Right, well, welcome everyone again. Welcome to Local Stories for December 2021. This is our online programme about the stories of local people and places. And it's great to get to this point because we started at the beginning of this year. And just whilst we were waiting to go on, Peter and I were having a look at the YouTube page. And even some of the live sessions have been really well attended, and some have been more intimate, and either way is great. But then the videos themselves, when they've gone on YouTube, have been really well watched. So we think it's been great, and it's definitely been amazing for us at the museum to hear more from people sharing their stories with us. It's sort of really enriching our knowledge of the local area. For today's session, actually, it did come out of a former session. In June, as part of Refugee Week, we talked to local people about their stories of members of their family being refugees, their migration stories, or we also had someone talking about how they had provided a home for refugees. And it was as a result of that session that Peter Schweiger, who I know through the museum, he said, you know, I've got a story about my family that I'd like to share. So that's what we're going to do this afternoon. Peter is going to share his story with us, which is absolutely fascinating. And then we'll have some time for questions. And then afterwards, I'm going to tell you a little bit of, just highlight some other stories we've got if you want to find out more on our website, and tell you a little bit about what's going on in the museum next year. So just to introduce Peter, I've known him for a long time through the museum, and he's been a great supporter of the museum, but he's also a really active resident in the local area, in the community. He's tree warden for Amersham, so he has a forestry background, as well as what he'll tell you he did a lot of the time. I don't want to spoil that at the moment, but he's really involved locally in lots of groups. But for a long time he worked in London, and he'll tell you about what he did there. So Peter, I'll hand over to you, and I hope everyone really enjoys the talk.
Thank you, Emily. Well, I'd like to start by stating the obvious. If it wasn't for our parents, we wouldn't be here. And if my parents hadn't been refugees, I wouldn't be here either, because they were refugees from Nazi Germany. And a lot of their relatives and my mother's parents did die in Auschwitz, were murdered there. So it's the obvious that if it wasn't for them being refugees and fleeing from a country where they'd grown up, had all their friends, had their homes, their work, everything else, I wouldn't be here. And of course, refugees are usually younger people who have, if you like, not got so many ties that older people have to their homes and their families and friends and so on. And they're younger people who can dare to take that leap into the unknown, to flee from what they think and probably can see is going to be a very unpleasant time for them if they stay. So I'd like to start by showing a picture of my parents shortly, well, about 2 years after they married. So can we start sharing the screen, Emily? I pressed the button.
It should be fine.
It doesn't. That's a picture of my parents taken, I would think, about 2 years after I was born. And have a look at this locket that my mother's wearing. You'll see it in a moment on the next, well, not on the next one, but the one after. That's a picture of my mother with her brother Frank, taken in exactly 100 years ago, June 1921. Her brother Frank also was a refugee and had 6 months in Buchenwald concentration camp when he was 17, and then was able to come to England on a guaranteed job scheme that was held, and people could, in a way, bail Jewish origin people out of Germany if they had a job. So he came as a farm labourer to a family in Melton Mowbray, and I'm still in touch with them. And then when he was old enough, he joined the British Army, and I'll tell you more about that later. So there's the locket that my mother was wearing, and it's got a Jewish symbol, which sometimes I think looks a little bit like a swastika. I mean, it isn't, of course, but there is some similarity there. And that's a picture of the her great-grandparents, who gave all their grandchildren a golden locket on their golden wedding. And so that was quite a gift. And my brother Frank, when he was in the army, managed to rescue these things shortly after the war. And I'll tell you more about that later as well. So before people could emigrate, before my mother could emigrate in 1938, she had to read all this in Gothic German script, all about how you can emigrate if you fulfill all the conditions. And that was the certificate that she got, complete with swastika. And she lived in Wiesbaden, where her parents were. And so in May 1939, she left Germany. All these papers were in the back of the passport, which I'm going to show you. And that's the immigration stamp that she received at Harwich, and how she came through Holland as well on the way. And of course, it would have been steam trains. And the visa was valid for a single journey to the United Kingdom, as you can read, for 13 shillings and sixpence, which she had to buy in the British consulate in Frankfurt on Main. So there's quite a lot of running about. A bit like when you go to the United States, there are all the hoops and hurdles that you have to comply with. Well, there were plenty then too. And also on the left-hand side, you can see she was allowed to register at Harwich, and she had to be employed as a resident in service in a private household. And she'd got a job as a nanny with a bank manager in Bognor Regis. Now, my mother had trained as a nursery school teacher before that, and it had to be a Jewish training school that was in Bad Nauheim, which wasn't very far from Wiesbaden, and I've visited that part. So there's a picture of my mother, and they had to have a middle name put in that was German. So that's why it's Barbara Zara, and her family name was Goldstein, which translated means Goldstone. And there was a bit of a pun on that made, but you can see how she had to go and see the president of the police in May 39 and fill in all her details. But of course, this is just another page of her passport. Going back to my father, this is a picture of the hometown where he grew up, called Weinheim. And that's not very far from the twin town that Amersham is twinned with, called Bensheim. And this picture shows the two castles and the little town. That's a Pezzolozzi school. And then the railway in front. Weinheim also has a big tannery, or had a big tannery, called Freudenberg. And I used to buy some of our upper leather from there, because in my working life, my father before me had a shop in London making footwear. And so we bought leather for the shoes from Weinheim. And the painting was of interest to the museum in Weinheim, because he was called Mulfinger, and he would go around the area painting scenes, local scenes, or people's houses and things like that. And he built up quite a big reputation. So they and some of those paintings were sold for a lot of money. Anyway, so they were very pleased when I offered them this picture, and I was able to be put in touch with them through the Bensheim organization, because one time here in Amersham, we used to do bed and breakfast. And when they had the exchange visits with people from Bensheim, we would have people staying in our home. And so they could link me up with the people. Also, I was born in England. I was conceived during the war and born in 1945 in October after the war had finished. So I can say I was born in the peace. And my parents always spoke English to us. I had a younger brother, Martin, and so at home we always spoke English. Why? Because then they could talk to each other in German, my parents, with things that they didn't want us to understand necessarily. However, when we'd go on holiday, we often went on holiday to Germany, and there we would play with the children and we learned to speak German. And then at school, we always did French, so I wasn't able to do an O-level in German. And it was when I then went to train as a forester with the Forestry Commission that for 2 years I was in a forest between Winchester and Romsey. And I'd go on a Wednesday evening swimming in the pool at the Southampton Western Docks. And afterwards, I'd go to the Eastleigh Technical College and did an O-level in German. And I was never terribly good at school, but I got the best grade in O-level with the oral, a grade 1. So I was quite chuffed about that. And so with the curator of the museum, I could speak German. I'm pretty fluent. I'm also in the U3A German conversation group. So that's a good excuse to keep practicing it. But an even bigger excuse is that my wife is from Hamburg. And I'll tell you a bit more about how we met later on, because it was through my grandfather. So that's the picture of that. Now we're going back to my father. This is now a sort of Thai restaurant. But when my father's father had this building, it was a shoe shop, and he also sold leather. And if you enlarge this name here after the war, they call it Judengasse, which means German lane. And it's on the high street. This is the high street. I have got photographs of the high street in the 1920s as well as now. And it's a very pretty little town, just like Bensheim is. But what caused my father to be a refugee was that from one of these upstairs windows, his brother was incensed in 1934 by a Nazi official in his uniform, SA they called themselves, stopping people going into his father's shop to buy shoes because they didn't want, the Nazis didn't want Jews to have a business. They didn't want people to buy from Jewish people. So my uncle Arthur used an air gun and he shot at this official and hit him in the thigh, bruising his leg. But it didn't take Sherlock Holmes to work out where the shot had come from. And so he was hauled off to court in, well, where was it? Not that far away anyway, and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Well, in the meantime, my father was very much under the radar, as it were, or on top of the radar from the Nazis. And so he felt it would be better if he left Germany in 1934. his brother's body was discovered a week after he was released from prison in 1935. And he's buried in the Jewish cemetery in Weinheim, or near Weinheim. And we've been able to go and see his grave. But my father went first to Holland. My father at that time was about 29. Well, he was born 1908. Hang on, how's my maths? Anyway, so he went to Holland, and then he went and he met an English woman who he then married and came to England. Well, the marriage wasn't a very happy one, and he did have a son who was my half-brother. But then his wife committed adultery, and so they divorced, and so that was another story. Now, my father, when he came to England in 1935, had been making insoles to go into people's shoes. And within a year, he took out a patent. And it's an interesting patent in that it was just in 1936 with the abdication. And you can see how Edward VIII's name had been crossed out and George IV was put there. And he was granted this patent for an improved orthopedic compensating device for insertion and fixing into footwear. Essentially, yeah, people could buy ready-made shoes and then have the pain in their feet pretty well cured by putting pads at the right spot. And I learned how to do that as well. And it was wonderful how instantaneously people could get relief from the balls of their feet, which might have been hurting, or fallen arches that were causing their ankles to hurt. And I carried on making that when I ran the firm in years later. Now, with this patent, he then was able to get, in 1940, a doctor to write a letter to him so that he wouldn't be interned on the Isle of Man, as very many other refugees were. I went on holiday this September to the Isle of Man and saw their museum there for internees and refugees. And the refugees felt, they escaped from a potential imprisonment in Germany only to be imprisoned by the British. But many of them were released after only a few months. But at least my father avoided being interned at all. So he was lucky for that. Now, this is completely out of context. It's a group of the U3A taken a couple of months ago, looking at the grave of Benjamin Disraeli at Hughenden Manor. And this is where the crypt has been covered over. There were steps leading under the church, and his body is buried there together with his family and so on. But Disraeli's father also had been Jewish, and he then converted to Church of England because he thought it was convenient, and Disraeli found it was expedient to be Christian in a Christian country where Jews are not always made very welcome. And so that's why I introduced Benjamin Disraeli. Now, my parents met at a Quaker settlement in the Wye Valley in a small village called Brockwere, where during the war, people from London could have a break from the bombs in London, and they could help in a market garden and deliver the produce to Monmouth by bicycle. Now, they were Quakers. Now, of course, with the Jewish background, they had seen what was going on and heard what was going on, and of course were, like many other Jewish people, not at all happy about it. However, they found that they could somehow get peace of mind by feeling if you can get some sort of reconciliation, you can get more peace of mind. My mother's brother had joined the British Army and learned to drive a tank. And he was on the second wave after D-Day into France and then through Holland and then through Germany and wound up in 1945 in Hamburg. And we've got a marvelous handwritten letter by him saying how Hamburg is no more damaged than any other German city he's passed through. Well, we know that Hamburg was pretty well flattened, but that was written for the censors. Now, my uncle Frank then went into British Army of the Rhine into intelligence. And because he had been brought up in Germany and could speak German fluently, he'd go into hairdressers, for instance, and listen to the other customers bragging about what they'd done to Jewish people, and then promptly turn around and arrest them. Not because he was in uniform, they all presumed he couldn't speak German. So he was pretty disgusted by what he found out. And he vowed never to return to Germany once he was demobbed. He married a woman from Hanwell, and together they emigrated in 1950 in a 10-pound assisted passage to Melbourne. And Frank had the agricultural interest, and so he had trained after he left the army at an agricultural college and became a farm manager in Australia. Well, that didn't go too well for him in that a vet was treating a horse and the horse kicked my uncle so badly that it damaged his leg and he was unable to carry on as a farm manager. So he went into being a postmaster and running a village store, which he did on the outskirts of Melbourne. But my parents, in the meantime, and my Uncle Frank, of course, was very much against the Germans, whereas my mother had, through him, in a way, where's the next picture? There we go. No, I didn't want to go there. Through him, he was able to find his old nanny in Wiesbaden. And she had hidden a lot of the family treasures, if you like the gold locket, and also pictures. And I'll come on to those later as well. But he was, and so he put my mother in touch with this former nanny. And the former nanny then got a job with a vicar in Bentheim, not Bensheim, but Bentheim, a town on the Dutch border. And in 1949, I went with my mother and we visited her and in this vicarage. And it was quite amazing that as a 4-year-old, we went to a wedding, or I went to a wedding, and there was a little bridesmaid and I was the page, and we thought we were being married, but it wasn't us. Anyway, let's carry on. So now we're going back to my father. My father bought this building in 1954, and before that he had done so well with his foot supports that he was able to buy up this firm called James Taylor and Son. And after the war, trading under the name of Hannes Schweiger wouldn't have been quite the thing. So James Taylor and Son is what the firm has been called ever since. And my father managed to get a National Health Service contract in 1948 to supply hospitals with and their patients with footwear. And the building in Paddington Street was put up in 1790, the first occupants were shoemakers. But in 1790, there were an awful lot of shoemakers everywhere. 10% of the population, I believe, were shoemakers. And so Paddington Street had 6 other shops making shoes in Paddington Street. And the family used the whole house initially, and there's a basement underneath. And at the back, there was an open courtyard with a privy, but no drainage into the mains. And then in 1860, when the grandsons had to sell up, a firm of sanitary engineers moved in. And so we've got drain covers with the address of the place with the sanitary engineer's name on. Anyway, that's my last day as boss of the firm in 2011. And so we had quite a mixed gang. Yeah, there they are all smiling. We got a passerby to take the picture. And the other thing is that we're on a pavement with marble edging, and these cellar flaps open up so you could get the big finishing machines in and out. I won't go around the details of who they all are, except that he's Hungarian, he's Polish, he's Greek, she's British, so she's Irish, and she's Chinese. Oh, and I've forgotten where she came from, but never mind. There we go. So there's the shop front. And it's still very much like that. I sold up, not without difficulty. It's very hard to find a person to buy a firm from a small business. And so I used a company to promote it. And the way they did it, instead of most accountants would say, well, you know, this is the turnover, this is our asking price, and then people come and knock the price down and down and down. This firm instead went to 200 firms initially, saying that we're in a similar field to yours, would you like to buy it? And then they whittled it down, and what they did, they projected figures forward of what our turnover was and what it could be, and then asked for bids. Well, eventually I had 3 firms that I was very interested in selling to. And then I chose the one with the youngest managing director, if you like, and had a 3-year contract to work part-time. Well, after 18 months, he had sacked nearly everyone except these 2, under one excuse or another, and brought in work experience people who he could pay less money to. And then after 18 months, it was my turn to be pushed out. And he said he couldn't afford my wages, and could I take a couple of months off? Well, after a month, I got bored, so I wrote and said, no, I'd like to come back. And he offered me a rate that was hardly covered the fares from Amersham. So I said, no, that's unacceptable. So he then took me to a court for... No, he dismissed me for gross misconduct. And I had to go through all the process of being dismissed on that with interviews. So then I responded by taking him to an industrial tribunal and sued him successfully for unfair dismissal. So how many people do you know who sold a business and then claimed unfair dismissal? A bit unlikely, isn't it? But it did sour it. However, I'm still his landlord, so I have to work with him up to a point, and things have mellowed down over 10 years.
Peter, could I? I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit more about Shoemaker. I'm just a little bit conscious of time.
All right.
But I know you've made shoes for some quite famous people, either with local connections or more so. Could you tell us a little bit about some of them?
Yes. Well, we made shoes for the MP for Amersham, Sir Ian Gilmore. He's still alive, And he had very long, narrow aristocratic feet. Now, every customer we make shoes for, we make a pair of lasts with their name on, and they're all named and numbered so that whenever they order more shoes, they can be sure they'll fit. And this is a scene of our basement workshop, and behind there is an old range that would have been used by the original family when they were there in 1790, perhaps. And then, yeah, there are more lasts in another area of another part of the building, and that's a bit of the shop with all these various. And there's even the patent. I think that's there. Let's carry on. And there's me when I was 4. And now the shoes I was wearing were probably made for me by my father. That's a pair that were definitely made for me by my father. When they were my first shoes, which I still have, and I have a collection of miniature shoes at home, about 400 of them. And so those are welted. That means the leather soles are sewn on to the upper. It's a Veltschirn construction, which means the upper is turned out over the sole. And of course, they got buckles, and they had laces and fringe buckles. They had the works. Now, I was talking about my Uncle Frank. This is a portrait that we have hanging up in our dining room. They are 7 generations before me. This is Joseph Schlesinger. Now, Schlesinger is a name that has a lot of descendants in South Africa and New York and America. And there was a Schlesinger who was a government official in the United States. Now, those pictures survived. They were rescued from my mother's nanny by Uncle Frank, and they fitted into his kit bag. But there were a whole lot of portraits of other family members that were bigger, and he took them out of the frames and folded them up. And unfortunately, being pastel paint, they somehow collapsed and disappeared. So there's Friedrich Binner, his wife, with a beautiful hood. And I think it's about 1840, but it's not easy to date. You can see my hand in the reflection of the painting. Then this is a picture of my mother's parents. He was called George Goldstein, and this is Margarita Goldstein, but she was born Lasker, and she was a descendant of those portraits I just showed you before. And they loved going for walks in the beautiful forested hillsides around Wiesbaden and so on. And there's a picture of George Goldstein getting out of his car. Now, my Uncle Frank was a bit of a practical joker, and so he said he had shown, when they were children, when he was a child, said he had shown my mother how to drive the car, and the car was in the garage. So they started up the engine, and he said, push this gear in here, and you'll put it into gear, and push that there. Anyhow, she drove straight out of the back of the garage, which didn't amuse their father. But their father was a PhD from Halle University, and he had, in the early 1900s, started an organization for working people who didn't have holidays. And the idea was that companies would subsidize their staff to go on holidays in hotels, and especially the wives would have a break from all the chores of housework. Well, in 1933, when the Nazis came to power, all directors of businesses and companies were dismissed. They were given a small amount of compensation and a tiny pension, maybe, to live on. But it was a pretty tough time then for him. Now, one of the hotels that he commissioned to be built in 1930 was this one. It's in Bauhaus style. It was built in very short time, in about, I think, less than a year. And this head of this man is an architect who restored this building because during the Nazi time, Hitler didn't like Bauhaus style, and he had lots of the Bauhaus buildings destroyed. But this one, being built near Stuttgart, was sort of tucked away in the mountains and hidden. You can see the wooded hillside there. And then the organization for giving people holidays was resurrected after the war, and they used it until about 1960. I went on holiday and stayed there with my mother. As a sort of compensation, they allowed us to have family holidays there. Anyway, then about 1960, this firm closed down and the building was left derelict for about 20 years until the local authority or county of Hesse thought they'd resurrect it as a conference centre. And this man, Helmut Kubi, is an architect, and he had to renovate it. And they spent much more money renovating it than it originally cost to build. Anyway, he wanted to find out who commissioned the building to be put up, and he tracked down the Jewish organization in Wiesbaden, where my mother lived, and eventually found me. And so he invited me to come to openings of this place, and we've been to visit him several times. There's another view of it. Looks a little bit like an ocean liner. And this figure here is where the swimming pool used to be. But when they made it into a conference centre, they thought that would be a bit risky, and it was filled in. But quite a pile. My grandfather had 50 hotels he was responsible for before he was dismissed. And it was indirectly through him, there's another view of it, that I met my wife, who's from Hamburg. We went to another of these, in German it's called Kaufmannserholungsheim, in the Eifel, where we met a family from Hamburg. And they said they knew someone who wanted to come as a paying guest to England, and would we know someone who could take her in? And my parents said yes, they would take her. Anyhow, she came in 1965. 10 years later, I got married to Angelica, and she would say that she's been a paying guest ever since. Anyway, now in that same town called Bad Urach, they had a secondary school, would be the equivalent here. But it's also a Kaufmann, so that means businessman school, business school. And they renovated it, and they put up a completely new building, which is in passive house style. So it was quite a break from traditional building. And they wanted to name it after someone who had connections with their locality, who had education. He had George, and who had also suffered under the Nazis. And he had died in Auschwitz. And so that they came up with this idea of naming him George Goldstein. And this is a floor plan of the school. So it's built around a courtyard. And it uses very little heat in the winter, and it's very nice and cool in the summer. So it uses very little energy. And there is a picture of me with my cousin Lee, who came from Melbourne. So my uncle Frank had 3 children, and Lee is his oldest daughter, and he had 2 sons as well. And Lee came. Now, my uncle Frank died in 1975. This was 2012 when the school was named after him, and they had a big ceremony, and I came there, and so did Lee, all the way from Australia, and it was a fantastic do. So the name of my grandfather lives on through this school, and I'm very pleased. And I continue to have contact, and I had a Christmas card from them this year again. So we'll do that. And there it is in lights. Quite a sight. At night, that's what it looks like. And the scholars wear T-shirts with the logo like that and the name of the school on it. And that's where I live in Amersham. So we're handy to Hervines Park and the station, and it's a Metroland house, and we've got some grapes growing up the front of the house, which aren't particularly nice, but never mind, we make jam out of them. And I've lived there since 1985. And we don't have solar panels, but we have a Velox window in the loft, which certainly gives plenty of natural light.
Peter,
So, questions?
thank you so much. It's really interesting. You'd spoken to me before, but listening again about all your family members was really, really interesting. I know I've got a couple of questions, but I wonder if anyone else would like to ask you anything, either about your family or about your job. If you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and ask.
You're muted.
Shall I start?
Yes, go on, Alison. I
was just really interested that your mum kept those connections and returned to Germany for holidays and things, because I know I imagined it was more common not to want to go back. So just perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that. Did she have German friends, non-Jewish German friends that she kept, or?
Yes, they were non-Jewish German friends. If they had been Jewish friends, they wouldn't have been there anymore.
Exactly, yeah.
And so it was because of this Quaker influence that she felt that it was much better to have reconciliation and rebuild the contacts that she had from before the war. So, for instance, we went back and we did, I remember, visit the architect who built that hotel. And his daughter kept coming to the reopening as well over, I mean, I'm now 76. And so it goes back a good score of, well, several scores of years. And so, yes, so we went back, and the nanny who had the job with this Roman Catholic vicar, the vicar turned out to be the brother of a friend who we made when we lived in Northwood. And she now lives in Switzerland. So we seem to have sort of all these connections. She also went back to visit her old school friends, and they had reunions. She also went back to celebrations of this organization, the Kaufmanns of Horlemsheim, where her brother was invited as well. You know, that was before 1975, and he didn't want to come. So, but she went back, and the new boss of the organization was a bit dubious somehow, because after all, he had survived through the Nazi times. And why? You know, only because he had probably shocked his colleagues. But there we go. But you had a different experience.
No, I've not heard of that experience. Where your mother sounds like an extraordinary woman to have done that.
Yeah, she was quite a character. Yeah.
Thank you.
Speaking of characters, Peter, could you, we discovered, or you mentioned to us, an interesting connection that you had made shoes for the expressionist artist Marie-Louise von Monteschitsky, who many of you probably know. We've got some of her paintings in our collection, but the Amersham link, it's not an Amersham link at all, is it? It's just a coincidence.
Well, she came to my shop with her mother initially, and they've been refugees, I think. Yeah. Anyway, her mother, and then she had shoes made by me. And of course, when you make shoes one-off, it's very personal. You're measuring around their feet. You get to know their soles. Sorry about the pun. And the and so they come initially to be measured, then they come for fittings, and then to try them on when they're finished again. And sometimes there are further adjustments needed because nothing touches the body more closely than footwear, much more closely than clothes. Shoes can draw blood if they're wrong. Clothes don't normally. And so Louise Matuszewski came and we made several pairs for her. And I told her I lived in Amersham, and she said, oh, she loved Amersham and she had lived there. And I know where she lived, and it was in the corner of Chesham Boys and Chestnut Lane. And she came to our home several times to take photographs of us because she wanted to do a sort of barter where I'd make her some shoes in exchange for a portrait of her family. Well, I made her the shoes, but unfortunately she died before she could do the painting. But she'd tell me about how she painted important people like the Archbishop of Canterbury and didn't know what clothes to put on to see him with. I don't know. Well, that's women. Sorry.
No, that's a good story. Would you also indulge us with the shoe last you showed me that you have in your office? Would you tell that story?
Oh, yes. Well, another famous, and I'll just go and get them down. I didn't expect to be asked that question.
Sorry.
I made shoes for the lady who enabled people to fly in their shoes, the author of Mary Poppins. So I will now get her lasts.
Thank you.
Yeah, here they are, or one of them anyway. So P.L. Travers is her name. She was a doctor. She wrote the Mary Poppins stories in the 1930s, in fact. And she lived near Regent's Park. And I found a copy that was printed in Germany of Mary Poppins. And the British Council were going to do an exhibition in Moscow. And I told them about this early edition of Mary Poppins that I had. And they took it with them, but they never returned it. It got lost. So there we go. But I did get P.L. Travers to sign it as well. So it was quite a valuable, or potentially valuable, sort of piece of book. Yeah, so yes, having a shop close to Harley Street, where a lot of doctors would refer patients to us who were sometimes well known, like Paul Getty. But anyhow, that's name dropping is all anybody ever wants to hear about.
Well, it's just the sorry, that's my fault, but the Mary Louise connection was just really interesting. You know,
she was a sweet woman.
Local connection with her, so we're just really interested in that. Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah, yes. It's me. Was the shop the one that on the left-hand side in Paddington Street, going down towards Marylebone High Street?
Yes, it's very close.
Oh, I remember it very, very well, actually. Yeah. So yes, it's in fact, I think my husband bought shoes from you, actually.
Good.
Yes, it was very much a specialist shop. And the other thing I wanted to ask you was, did you keep all the lasts after you'd sold the business? Or did they go with the business?
They went with the business.
They did, yeah.
You see, where people had passed on, the business wasn't very interested in them. Now, not many wooden lasts survive because they're wood, and in the olden days, shoemakers would use them as firewood. So, or a lot of lasts can be reused. So what we often did, we'd have them roughly sized up, and when another customer came in about the same size, we'd then build them up. And on this last, there are lots of pieces of leather to make the last a bit bigger for this customer. Although they might have been added on as she grew older, feet sometimes swell, and so you can add more leather to them.
Thank you.
Okay.
Does anyone else have a question?
Well, of course, I always commuted to Malib from Amersham. I nearly always used a bike to cycle to the station, leave it in the rack there. And at Malibone, I had another bicycle in the bike rack. When I first started using a bicycle, I'd leave them in the left luggage office, which was in the corner by the exit of the station. And there were just 16 bicycles there. And the man in charge of the office would look after them. And you had to pay £16 a year for that privilege. Well, now they've got thousands of bikes on Malibone Station, and you don't have to pay for the privilege, but you have to be a season ticket holder to be allowed to park there. So when I go up to London, I take my bike on the train, but of course out of peak hours. And I'm so glad there's a lift at Amersham Station now, so I don't have to carry the bike over the stairs.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's really, really interesting listening to you and for sharing your story with us. You know, it's quite personal to share your family story, so really, really, really grateful for you for doing that.
You're welcome.
I've got just a couple of bits if anyone's interested in other stories of refugee or emigres. If you go onto our website and you go onto the history of Amersham, and in the search box here, if you just typed in refugee or emigre, you'll get a list of articles that you can read. So some of them will be, a lot of them will be authored by Alison. Some of them will be about individuals. So there's one about Maurice Edelman. Some of them will reference local stories that we've done before. Some of the, so Mary Duras we've covered before, Leila Gur, Fritz Ludstick was one of the German refugee listeners at Latimer House. So there's lots of stories there. You just need to type that into the search box and you'll get some answers, and if you're interested in reading more. If you're interested in other previous episodes of local stories, if you just Google YouTube Amersham Museum, you'll get our YouTube page, and you need to click on videos and you can look at all of the previous episodes that we've produced this year, and you can sit and listen to them at your pleasure. And this one with Peter will be on there shortly. Now, other things that are coming up, since we're drawing to the end of the year, and we're looking forward to next year and doing lots of things within whatever next year might bring and the situation with COVID. But a few things I wanted to mention. We've been really enjoying putting together this project, Amersham Before Plastic, with the support of Amersham Community Board and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So we have been exploring and talking to lots of people about their memories about how people were perhaps able to be more sustainable in their behaviours, particularly in terms of, sort of consumption and shopping, than they are today. So we're looking at some lovely old photos from our archive, talking to people, and we've put together a little exhibition which we've started taking out in our van. We went to the market last week and the Christmas event on Saturday, and we're trying to get people perhaps to think about their behaviour today and make some changes, particularly in terms of the use of single-use plastics. There's lots of things there about shopping from the past and what we can do today. And if you want to read the exhibition graphics, Ralph, who does an amazing job on our website, has now put them on the website, and you can just click them like that, and you can see them all and read them at home and look at the pictures. So if some of you might have joined the local story shopping one a couple of months ago, and there's some memories from that we've included. So that's there. And there's also a bit at the end with some tips about things you can do, and you can make a pledge to say something that you'll change in the way you use plastic. So you'll see the van out and about. We've got someone called Natalie who's taking the van out, so it'll be out and about in the local community over the next few months. So if you've got an event or an activity you think it would be good for it to turn up at, just let me know and we'll try and organise it. Other things for next year, our next local stories is in January, and for the first time it's going to be an evening event, and the reason for that is because the people joining will be from all over the world. So we've tried to do it to fit people's different time zones, and it's looking at a piece of film footage that was filmed at Woodrow High House in I think the early 1960s, and it's about a project called Beyond the Gold, which was a sort of precursor to the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. And it's a promotional video, and it's just it's got some lovely scenes of Amersham High Street and bits and bobs. So people that were involved in that film are going to join and talk about it and talk about their experiences of being there. So it should be quite fun. I have got a few other ideas for local stories for next year, but if you have them too, then do let me know. In January, we've also got a talk with Helen Fry, who mentioned Latimer House just now. She's been writing a new book, so she's going to be doing a talk towards the end of the month. We have got the Martyrs play coming up in March, so the dates for that will be out in the new year. We'd love you to join us. We've got, if you're a friend of the museum, we've got a programme of activities planned, and that will be sent round shortly. We're also, once the plastic free exhibition is finished, we're working on an exhibition about fashion for next year, and sort of textile production, but also fashion and fashion locally. So we're just starting work on that. If you're interested in any of those things or getting involved, there's lots of different ways you can get involved as a volunteer, then do let me know. And on the subject of volunteers, we're also currently looking for new trustees at the museum. So if that's something that you think might interest you, then do also let me know and get in touch. I think that's everything that I had today. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, some of you join every month, so it's really nice to see you. And thanks for being part of Local Stories. And thank you again to Peter. It's really real privilege to hear your family story. Thank you.